unusual after a while. I was previously at CSM and did supervise PhD students, and then went across to the RCA. But what I'll do is I'll start by setting a little bit of context to the presentation and the work. I'm going to focus a little bit on reading as an approach to writing. And then perhaps what we could do is I'll set a little bit of broad context to it, because I know that people come from different practices here. I also want to sort of set scene and say that we all have different ways and approaches to doing something. And I want to make sure that you don't feel like, you know, there's one way of doing something. And that's really important as we start to go through that context. So I'm going to start by talking about it, and then we'll have a couple of exercises and sessions where we will, you know, I'll pop on and talk to you about different aspects of this. So I think Lucy, they're going to try to help me to put you guys in small groups as we go along, because I mean, there's nothing like sharing the pain of doing a literature review, isn't it? Because sometimes research can be a really lonely exercise. So if you're happy with that and you can hear me good, and can you see my slides? Yeah, brilliant. I'll start. And I hope to do this, I suppose, in relation to my own experience as a researcher, PhD supervisor, and also practitioner. And I think that we rarely acknowledge that how we present and what we present and how we look at the world is, of course, influenced and shaped by our own context, our own biases and agendas. So I'll start very, very briefly by giving you a sense of, you know, my educational and professional practice background. I was born in Chennai, which is now called, which was once called Madras in South India in the 70s. And I went to an English-speaking school, unlike 90% of Indian children. And it was a very middle-class upbringing and therefore very privileged. And as a child, I grew up reading books written in English and by English or American authors rather than by my own. And this has influenced my approach to reading. But I'm sort of coming full circle now back into an educational system to own that for myself. And I'm very conscious that we come from very different cultures and contexts. So I want to make sure that we learn from that and we absorb that rather than and use reading and writing as a reflection of that in this process, because it's got to be fun and meaningful. It's your research. So how do we kind of do that? Now, I work primarily in publishing, so of course I work with words a lot, but I work with it in an intercultural context. So a lot of my work as a designer is very research-led. Sometimes it's print, sometimes it's ebooks, sometimes it's a 100-year design project and publishing, and I'll talk a little bit about how you can set structures for things where you may not be involved at a later stage. And how you kind of set a scene for how people perceive your work or how you articulate your work. So this sense of being a graphic designer and a typographer is very much important to me and feeds the way I teach, I supervise, I examine, and also sets a context. So like I said, I did my master's at St. Martin's, and then I did my PhD at the University of Reading in typography and graphic communication. I'm now a dean at St. Martin's. I work in academic strategy, and I'm a reader in intercultural communication from a practice point of view. And previously, I was at the RCA. So my work here is really shaped by the students that I've taught, the experiences that I've had, and how I've learned from those students, and these different situations and these different cultural contexts. And I mentioned this here because it's very, you know, it's like, it's very easy to say, especially in an academic sense, well, someone who's the dean knows how to do things, or someone who's a reader has reached a certain place in their academic career, and therefore, you know, their approach is valuable, or they're an expert in something. And I want to touch on this idea of expertise as well, because in relation to you writing your literature and practice reviews. Someone who I'm very fond of reading, Ahmed Ansari, speaks about it really well. And he says, many of the concerns, questions, and observations that I'm about to raise from my own experience of negotiating between different cultures and trying to figure out the politics of my practice as both a designer and a researcher. And for me, this is very much anchored in the research and design projects that I do, which are primarily with reading. And I design for different types of reading and different audiences, whether that's children, adults, or scholars, or people just reading for fiction. So I'm quite interested in how you use your practice or how we use our practice, not just as a way of sort of organizing or thinking about things, but in a broader sense of how we situate the work, our texts, often by multiple languages, different readers, different language capacities and fluencies. And I'll come back a little bit to talk to you about what I mean by that. Now, when I did my master's at CSM, I read texts such as these: McLuhan, Elizabeth Eisenstein. I'm sure you're all familiar with some of these, even if you're not in a design discipline. And they reflected a belief, shall we say, or a perspective of knowledge that, of printing in specific here, as an agent that sort of swept from Europe and sort of transformed the rest of the world. And when I read the first text, Stanley Morrison's First Principles of Typography, it claimed that there was just one good way of translating or of designing a book. And I'm really opposed to this way of one way or one idea or one way of writing about something, one way of perceiving or framing something. And I'd really like us to think about the tension of that expectation that you feel people might have of a review and your own way of reading, perceiving, and framing the world. Now, in the context, why is this important? And I'll just run through that really briefly using this example. So here we have authors who are talking about, oh, great, how Europe and the printing revolution as an agent of change revolutionized information and communication. But there is actually a very different story because printing predates Gutenberg, from China, for example, in 700 CE, but also movable type in East Asia or metal type in Korea in the 16th century. And I think this is really important because there's a perception sometimes of knowledge. So it's described as a sort of universe, an expanding galaxy, as suggested by McLuhan. Um, but it's actually what it is a pluriverse. There are many, many points of origin of knowledge. And it's really important that we keep those in mind as we're mapping or as we're constructing, framing our reviews. So I think it's really important also this idea of neutrality. And I think academia has sometimes an issue in terms of we propose neutrality or this is how something should be, try and be neutral, try and evaluate, try and analyze. But when you come and you're working in contexts that are never neutral, this doesn't really have any relevance. And we know that every decision that we make, whether it's a designer or a researcher, affects the message and how it is actually communicated. So for me, in my practice, I think that it's really important that while I acknowledge the importance of craft in my work, typography in this case, I'm really interested in how we can use practice and whatever that practice might be for you, not just as a craft, but as a fundamental way in which creative people understand and engage with the world. And I'd like us to consider how we shape our reading, but also how we articulate this reading in different ways in our reviews of literature practice. So the other thing to also keep in mind is context of our work and our discipline. Now, because of the way knowledge is shaped, often with the global north or Anglo-American dominance, we can end up marginalizing different ways in which our disciplines exist. And some of the examples I refer to today might be anchored in an Indian context, and you might wonder, why is this relevant to you? Or you might look at a specific case study that's about a different place and situation. But here what I'm saying is that when I think of India or South Asia, I don't want to think of it as a national identity or geographical space, but as a framework, as a model that can be relatable to other models. And this is really important in how you anchor your discipline, but also how you relate your discipline or your model to others. So it's a question of both depth, but also a question of sort of breadth and relatability. The other thing is really that is important to remember in how we approach our research, whether that's a review or whether it's the research itself, is about framing. And this question about framing, for me, it was reminded about, David Attenborough talks a lot about how many of the issues we face today in the world are a result of communication or a failure of communication. Now, how we frame things, how we speak about them, how we articulate things visually is something that we need to be accountable for as creative practitioners. And this pervades even the simplest form of communication. It's really important when we're looking at PhDs, for example, and you're pursuing this thing called an original contribution to knowledge, that you question what that knowledge might also be and the boundaries of that knowledge that you're contributing to. I'll use a visual example. So this is a sculpture that you might have seen by Mark Wallinger in central London, and it's by LSC. And when I went to a performance with my daughter, we were walking across. Every single person who saw it, no matter what nationality or age or gender or anything, blurted out, "Well, it's upside down." And this can be a really dangerous thing because I think this is fundamentally a framing issue or a design issue because we're so used to seeing things habitually that we can other things very much. We can consider some things to be dominant or ways in which we look at the world, and then we disregard other ways or see those ways as wrong. And that becomes very problematic in the realm of knowledge. So I guess what I'm saying is that we need to think about when we're writing those reviews to be bold in thinking about how we turn the tables, how we show our view of the world from the perspective of perhaps the other, and how that changes. And this is sort of that tension that you might also feel, and I'll talk about it later in terms of that expertise. It's like, well, my examiner is the expert in my area, so what is my contribution? And I put across my approach and sort of my narrative through my research. In terms of the larger contribution of it, and I'm just going to show you 3 more slides before I jump into our workshop work today, this is a quote by an Indian on Indian education in 1835, I think, by Thomas Macaulay. And he was a British historian, and he was in charge of introducing Indian English concepts to education in India. And this remark was in a report that he makes, where he dismisses any alternative notions of knowledge on the basis that they are different. And in his view, the world is divided into civilized nations and barbarism. And he says that there are no books on any subject which deserve to be compared to European texts. And he goes on to refer to this hundreds and hundreds of years of knowledge as false, because it's very different from his own. So I think we also have to keep that power relation um, in play and understand what that power relation is in our contributions as we're making these contributions to knowledge. And the colonial legacy is a very painful one. This is another example, for example, of how Indian knowledge was colonized. This is an extensive text called the Garden of Malabar, and it's a really comprehensive treatise of the flora of the Western Ghats in India. Now, it was written in Latin and compiled over 30 years, and it was conceived by the then Dutch governor of Malabar. And the issue over here is that it has these beautiful pen and ink drawings. It's very detailed treatise on each of those. But the process of collating it, of putting together that research and of publishing that research was described as such by Hendrik van Reed. And he says that all the country around was diligently searched by the natives best acquainted with the habitat of plants. And then the fresh specimens were brought and then they were sketched. What's deeply troubling about this text is that while it was collated and compiled by natives, as they are so-called referred to, the Indian experts, it was only available in Latin till the 21st century. So my question here is that this text has been largely inaccessible previously because it's never been available in any Indian language. So here you have knowledge about India, written with Indian knowledge that's inaccessible to Indians. And this is very important in terms of work that we do with communities where we're, or participatory work, where we're relying on their expertise and their lived experience, how do they benefit from our research? We articulating our research not just academically, but to the people who contributed to it. And therefore, what is the purpose of our research? Is it purely academic, or how does it serve the communities that we're, or the initial reasons that of why we became interested in this research is something to keep in mind throughout our research careers as we go along, whether that ends up, whether you end up being an academic or whether you want to go back into professional practice. I think this is really that connection of why we're doing it is super important. And also, who are we? And I, leaving out of it in that sense. And this is one quote here is that this is the first time this language Tamil is printed and published in India, and it's for a colonial text. It's basically for a Christian text for a population that's largely non-Christian. So there's really also an act of power that is contained when we publish something. How do we use language to represent culture or religion back to people? So my questions to you as you're embarking on this is, how do you decide, who decides what is knowledge? Who decides what is this knowledge for, or this research for? And what role do we play as designers and researchers who frame this knowledge for reading? Now, Ahmed has written beautifully about this. He gave a talk in the, I think it was the Design History Society, maybe 2 years ago, where he speaks about the history of design and the designs of history. And I think it's worth you, I think he offers it very much freely on his blog for you to read it, because he talks about, well, what is our role in this larger meaning making, knowledge contribution? What is our role as researchers and designers? Having set that sort of broad context for us to kind of reflect on, I'd like to move to really this idea of why do we read? And I think it's really important before you start writing to really consider how you read, why you read. What does reading mean to each of us individually and collectively in our work and in our practice? Because this can be a way in which we understand how we approach research, how you build confidence in your research and in your own methods, but also how you articulate it to other people who may use or may not use the same methods that you do. I'm very fond of this quote by Alberto Manuel, who talks a lot about reading. And he speaks of reading as a sort of, he says, as a practical cartography. And he speaks of reading as mapping the world. And because writing literature and practice reviews can be lonely, difficult stuff, but if we think of our reading and of our writing as having conversations with those before us and us, it then provides a connection for why we're doing the research and what hope we have for our research. But fundamentally, that we understand that we're all reading to understand ourselves and where we fit in the world and our relationships with each other and the relationship of our work to other. And I think this is what Manuel says. He says, when we pay attention to our reading, it reveals ourselves. The reading shapes us, and it gives us a certain momentum. It gives us a certain direction, because that implicit nature of that reading leads us in certain directions. Now, on a pragmatic level, I want to just clarify that what we're talking about here is reading for different reasons. We read for information. So you go to a dictionary in a very different way. You go to a map in a very different way. You read for pleasure, and we read for study. And some of us, of course, might be reading for study, for pleasure. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are different ways in which you could read, and you can think about those different ways of reading, whether you're reading images, whether you're reading maps or diagrams, or whether you're reading in a particular way that you want to. So you can construct and actually play with those different kinds of reading. But also, in terms of an expectation, ignore the expectation about you should be reading academically. You should be reading academic books or texts. I think particularly in creative practice, the originality might come from where you're looking for your reading and what you're paying attention to. So for me, my work, I was going to get into intercultural communication, for example. My work has sort of instinctually led me there because of my interest in different things. So we all come from different professional backgrounds and different contexts. And I think context need to very much inform how we use our research, how we explain our research, and how we kind of articulate it rather than us kind of ignoring it. I'm going to stop, find a way to stop sharing for a second and just go to this one slide where I think that if Beth and can help us, what would be really nice is just break us a little bit into small groups. And what I'd like you to explore gently in your group is some of what you're reading. I don't want you to think just of journal articles and books, but perhaps everything that you've read recently that has caught your attention. It could be a magazine, a newsletter, a zine, a map, something that you've been drawn to, and perhaps what you've also watched or listened to, because those are also ways of reading. So I think what would be really helpful is if we started by introducing ourselves very briefly, maybe saying a little bit about our professional or cultural backgrounds or contexts that you feel are useful for people to know. How did you become interested in your topic of research? What was your journey to it? Because that's interesting as well. And I think it would be really good if we could take 5 minutes to sort of share some of this in the group, but also really talk about, well, what have you been reading and making those connections between the different things that you've been reading.
Yeah,
should have done is just given you guys like the next 30 minutes to each other, really. So interesting.
We've made you all presenters, so now you have the ability to speak and use your video. Sorry, I should have done that from the get-go.
Thomas has a complaint.
I'm so sorry to cut you off. You can reconnect later.
And don't forget the direct message function. You can direct message anybody through the chat function if you want to swap email details. Don't hesitate.
Well, is anybody interested either in the chat or you know, to just sort of reflect on if you did get to some of the reading questions, or was it really about connecting with people? Because it'll be just good to have one or two reflections to take us on to the next bit. Abby.
Hi, so in my group there were 2 first years and 2 of us were coming up for confirmation. So the first years I think were more focused on that traditional reading, but also like reading the news, and then I said that I read Twitter as something that's kind of outside of the box as a way of finding things that are up to date, and then one of our other participants reads comics as part of their research as well. So that's as far as we got.
That's a great pointer though, because I think that we all have different ways of getting to things, isn't it? And I think not to disregard that. I don't know if everybody else felt that strong sense of expectation. You guys seem much more confident or bolder about acknowledging the different sources by which we hear and listen or get information. But I certainly get quite a lot from my subject area. I get a lot from Twitter. But also that, you know, we have different modes of how things communicate, isn't it? And if it was only text, then your information would be very different. So Abby, that's really helpful. Thank you. And Linda's put a note here about radio as well. Naomi?
I wanted to be really brave and attempt to interpolate and extrapolate between our getting to know you things, because it seemed to me from our group something that was very common was this incredibly strong aspect of practice, and that people were reading through things and through practices, so that, you know, looking in archives and looking at artifacts was a really strong thing between 2 of us, but then other people were looking very much at you know, practices in, say, you know, community art commissioning and workshopping, and then this notion of the world and climate change and ecology as being part of kind of, if you like, the reading that one would do through place, space, activity. So it's very, very diverse kind of material based reading practices going on with us, perhaps backed up by the traditional text-based reading.
That's I think that's a really, really important reflection, because I think when I was doing my confirmation, my supervisor said to me, he said, "Rathna, you need to think of yourself as a dog that's jumping through a hoop in a circus." We have academic processes where you take yourself through certain processes, but to find a way to make that process suit your purpose, so that it's not just an academic process. And I think some of the things you're talking about is that reading of the world, really, and reading of ourselves in relation to the world, is how and why we do the work that we're doing. Joanna, I think you have your hand up.
Okay. Hi. So I think that we had a very nice discussion. We remembered each other's presentation from the last year's presentation. That was really interesting. And I think one thing that we agreed on is like the things we read. It's just that we have piles of books, and the reading process is going back and forth on one book, on another, an article coming back. So I think that's one thing we agreed on, and we exchanged a few titles as well. And the reading impacts our research, but also our person, like the way we interact with the world. So it's a much bigger impact. And we finished, and unfortunately we couldn't finish, and we didn't have a turn, but we discussed like how our background and where we're from impacts our research and what we read, and how we because the way you mentioned like India and your background and how it impacts what you read and how you see the world and your reading and your writing is really interesting. And because we all had different, so from Ireland, from China, and I'm French Portuguese, so that's going to impact how we see things and how we read. So we were starting that conversation when we
when we interrupted you guys. Well, we'll have a chance to hopefully take you back there. But Joanna, thank you for sharing that. I think that there's lots of talk about noses and reflections in the chat, which are really important. But I think the two things that really resonate from the reflections, I think, that are coming through is an original contribution we often feel is about, well, this is it, I found this. But contribution is also about, I saw this in a particular way. Like how we see things, how our methods are also our original contribution. So this idea about, I think Jenny's put it really nicely, being a dog with the nose to the ground, sniffing everything out, is really, and if we pay a bit more attention to the sniffing, I think it gives us a sort of design. It gives us a sense of how we approach things in our way as humans. It's a really, I'm sorry that we interrupted your very rich discussion. I think what we'll try and do, I don't know if we can actually kind of get you back into the same groups, but I'm going to go on to the next bit to talk about how we don't lose this. You talked about the stack of books. I think Naomi talked about the breadth of things. So I'd like to go on to just talk a little bit about visualizing and mapping as a tool to help us sort of think those through, or sort of help us speak to ourselves a little bit. And then maybe we'll see if we can have a bit more space for you to chat about things, if that's okay with everybody. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to go back into, and of course it's taken me all the way back, so which slide were we on? So you sort of preempted this slide actually, and I think that for me, oops. Try again. Sorry, I'm having a bit of difficulty in navigating down to the slide that I need. So I think it's going to force me to do this in a painful way. Yeah. So I think you preempted this slide, really, which is that we are who we read. And I think it's absolutely critical as you're approaching reviews, never to ignore that, because how you read is a way into understanding your reading. And when you understand your reading, you're able to direct how other people understand it. So we have very indirect ways of approaching our reading. And I talk a little bit about instinct and visuality in the next sense. But pay attention to that nosing quite a bit, how you approach it, articulate it, what connections that you make to the different things or texts. And by text, I mean, you know, visual text, but also the world, reveals how we frame the world and therefore our research. And that, again, it goes back to this point about, you know, what is this unique way in which we see the world. I'm going to share some of the things that our previous students or colleagues have used, which I rely on quite a lot, because as a visual practitioner, for me, reading is visual. It's very, very visual. And for me, words have always been about images and areas and practices. So rather than think of them as a list of texts, I think I like to go back to what Manuel talked about cartography and about reading as mapping. And this is a part-time student at the Royal College, Tessa, who's an animator, some of you may know, working through her review and her areas through practice, by a drawing, but also through mapping. And I think mapping can help us locate and organize our research or our reading in a way that we can then articulate it to others. And I was quite interested that when I came into the conversation, into the chat, someone was thinking, well, can we use images? Not just to illustrate the work, but perhaps to share how you think about something, to visualize your thought process, not just through words, but through maps, for example, can be really an effective way of getting your examiners there quite quickly. I would recommend this article, though it's about typography in screen-based media. It's called Dynamic Literature Mapping, and it's by someone called Joyce E, who's a colleague. And what Joyce has done in this spread really is that not only has she mapped her reading, but she sort of organized it into in different ways. So you see the bigger disciplines, visual communication and media, there at the top. But what you're also seeing is the primary sources in the center, a set of secondary sources, what else is feeding in, and then the tertiary sources. So then you start to recognize, you know, for yourselves, what might be primary for you, what might be secondary for you, and what might be tertiary. And if you think that this is a useful exercise to do now, and a quick note in the chat, we can actually take a few minutes for you to just take a little bit of a pen and paper and see and test that out and see if that's for you a place in which you can kind of start to unpack this breadth of stuff that you do. Now, this doesn't have to be just what you're reading, but it can also be practice areas. So this is where and it can be also for practice-based PhDs, the relationship between what is my written piece, for example, and what is my practice submission. So you use it, I've used it in different ways, in different levels or stages of my research, to help me kind of unpack and understand a bit better how I think, how I'm formulating the research. So let's try and take a few minutes to just sort of good question, Naomi. I think this was like ages ago, so it was just a design program. What I use is Miraboard, so I use Miro quite a lot to do that because it forms the connections for you really interestingly. Yeah, great. Okay, so shall we take a few minutes? I think it's about 12:13. Just 5 minutes to just quickly sketch out and test where you're at in the stage that you're at. What are the different things that are playing? What are the different partners who are the different companions for you in your process right now? Just 5 minutes. And while you guys do that, I'm just going to race and get a power cord and come back.
Rathna, sorry, this isn't groups, is it?
No, I think we could keep it individual.
Great, perfect.
Then we can just, yeah. Beth, I'm just going to close my screen and just get my power cord and come right back.
Of course,
Yeah.
yeah, no problem.
Yeah. So I'm going to gently pull us back, if everybody's okay with that, because I know also that I'm conscious of time. I think I'll also send perhaps Beth and Lucy the links. If some of this is useful, I'm happy to sort of send that along, and you can that I've mentioned, and others as well. Yeah. So if there anybody else wants to reflect or share their thoughts, please do. Otherwise, I'll gently move us on to the next bits. Great. Yeah. I'm going to zoom in for 1 second and then pull back out. But I will send you the articles and the links to them, because Joyce and all of them have it on their blog, so it's pretty easy for you to have a look at the maps.
Thank you, Rathna. Yeah, if you send them to me, I'll get them circulated out.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Going back. So the next bit I think that I want in Joyce's map, you could see that she's starting to make connections, and you could see different colored kind of lines, if you will, on her map. And I think as light and ephemeral as they are, I think taking time to stay and to sort of reflect over time those connections and kind of coming back and redrawing the map. Don't be afraid of doing that, because the connections of how we do things is as important as the things that we're putting on the page. When you have formal situations like literature reviews and things, I think it's really hard to step away from the expectations of what you think your examiners or supervisors might want to see. But I think to hold that ground very carefully, to remember that research is really instinctual. You know, how we read, what we're drawn to read, which we spoke about earlier, and those indirect connections are really about how that interconnectedness is what people are really interested in. That makes for interesting reading and interesting research, because it's about how you view the world quite uniquely. So as you were drawing the map, you might have been listening to your own voice about the direct but also the indirect connections between your reading and the practice mapping. And you might have realized also how big the work is that you're trying to do, and where something is directly important, and where something is just sort of a nice to have. And I think that's also something that's really important, is to decide what is connected to our work, but also what is not connected to our work. So a lot of learning about how I research or read has also been about following my nose. And I think someone mentioned that in the chat, and paying attention to why I'm drawn to some things and trusting my intuition about it. The purpose of research is really to make new connections or discoveries, to explore ways in which other people may not have, to uncover these findings and methods. And this means that research can be unpredictable, but therefore anchoring ourselves in how we do things and how we see the world is really helpful in the process. And connecting with how other people do it, just like you did in that conversation, becomes really integral to understanding how we do things in relation to others. So when I'm reading, it's also really important for me to pay attention to the fact that sometimes I'm not interested in a text, and the text is not connecting with me. And we often think that has to do with us in not a good way, but I think pay attention to that and consider why, and don't be afraid to just abandon the text and move on. You might come back to it, but there may be a very good reason as to why it's not speaking to you right now. So start paying attention to those underlying reasons and consider them, rather than forcing yourself to push on something. That's how you build momentum and confidence in it. A good practice review is knowing what to include, but very, very importantly, when an examiner is reading your practice review, they're also looking at that you know what to leave out. And you need to make those decisions quite boldly, as I've said. I think previously in our education, we have to show in our undergraduates, for example, or even in our postgraduates and our MAs, how much we have learned. But as academics, we don't do that. What we do is we express your expertise through clarity and insight rather than the quantity of what we know. So it's quite a different beast in how we're writing a review to how you perhaps wrote an undergraduate dissertation in showing that knowledge, but here you're showing your insight, if that makes sense. The other thing to keep in mind is also that reading is not reviewing. So we review literature for our benefit. We find out what has been done to find useful information, to understand the fields that we're working in. But when you're writing a review, you're writing for somebody else to read. So you're switching tack a little bit. We write our reviews as a separate process because we want other people to review what we're doing. And therefore, we need to provide background and context and justification for our research. So don't just focus on the review, which is our process, but think about the person that you're writing for, who's going to your reader, who might be your examiner, who might not be, but who is the reader of that piece of your review. So then you start to think about talking about the design of your research, your methods, your approach, and then ultimately your original contribution. And I find that flipping between why I'm reading and reviewing and keeping this idea of how I'm going to articulate it, a person, thinking of how they're going to read it and how I'm going to design this piece of work for their reading helps me keep the reading that I have to do for the review in context, because otherwise it becomes a very, very big piece of work that I then need to pursue. And I might pursue it in other chapters, for example. I might pursue it in my practice. So just keep in mind this idea of reading and reviewing and the balance of that. We review, we read and re-review, but when we're writing, we're reading for other people to sort of read. And I think that for me, this reading always considers the other person, that examiner. How are they going to? How am I going to articulate that? And I think this is where, for me, the gaps, it's sort of the boundaries of what we draw is a part of that design. So don't worry about leaving things out. State what you're leaving out and be very intentional about it. And this means thinking about what the reader needs to know about your work rather than what you want to infer about your expertise. So what is useful for them to know about where I'm at in my process and how I'm designing my research. Now, we started by talking about why the research is important to us, who we are, how that defines the research, why we're undertaking it. And this really is the foundation of a good literature and practice review, is that ownership. Now, you might be worried about the confirmation exam and think, well, we spoke about this earlier, the examiner's expertise when you're writing or reading. But when I come in as an examiner to a confirmation, I'm really interested in the perspective or the approach that the researcher has taken, and that's what the focus is on. So you lead from your common ground and your areas of expertise, and then it becomes much, much more interesting for someone to read, but it also becomes easier for you to defend. So I know that others are going to be talking to you about writing over this period of time, but when I'm working on different research projects, I'm always thinking about, well, how will somebody else look at this or think about this? And I think the conversations that you started to have in the group are really, for me, became the foundation of, well, let somebody else read this and what do they think? Or let me go and have a cup of tea and chat about this with somebody. Less easy to do, I think, in a pandemic, but do try and keep those connections on with people who are at the same stage of you as you in your research, because they understand very much better in the depth of where you are in your research, how to articulate it, and can kind of pull you out from that sort of rabbit hole that's very necessary for research. And I think the last thing I would say is, don't, I organize it. I use Scrivener a lot. I don't know if you guys use Scrivener, but for me as a visual writer, I find writing quite intimidating, and starting from a blank page of So I start writing in pockets. I write what I know and then identify the gaps. So it's a little bit, I call it visual writing for me, but it's like those maps. You're mapping the areas that you know. And it's a sort of trust in yourself that you will get there rather than intimidating yourself about, well, I've got to have the start, I've got to have the middle, and I've got to have the end. And the way that I do it is also through mapping the writing. What are the kind of areas? What are my core concepts that I want to cover? What is the previous research that's feeding into this? What are the questions that I have that I want to answer in the paper? What are the gaps in my knowledge that I need to address? And I start to kind of sketch and map that, first visually, because again, writing about it becomes problematic, then taking the visual and starting to map those areas in pockets, just as really, really brief notes. Now this looks perhaps a little bit organized. It's not usually. I have tons of these rows on research over here where I'll just be writing tiny notes to myself, not to forget, and then starting to collate those notes and those observations or those reflections into what might be a practice review, or in this case, the chapter on design research for Routledge. And then I consider, as I'm doing this, just like you were reflecting in the mapping, is what is the spine or the thread of my narrative in the review that's beyond just reviewing? What is my purpose? What am I trying to dig out? What are the gaps of what other people have written about that I'm trying to fill? What are the bits of practice that I'm trying to map? What are the connections between different practices that I'm trying to get to? And this then connects the different parts of my review. But it also, later on, you could use the same strategy to connect the different parts of your thesis or your structure, or your contents page, or how you're structuring your thesis, or the relationship of practice to your practice submission to your writing, for example. What sits where and what sits where, and you can keep kind of using this as a mechanism. I'll stop, but I want to just end with one thing that I think is really, really important. When I started my PhD, I think that you always have this impression from the outside that someone who has a PhD must be really smart. I don't think that's the case. I'd say that for me, a PhD is really about a commitment to yourself. And a good PhD, a good piece of work, is we've had the courage to bring ourselves to the work, because that's what makes it genuinely original and innovative. And don't forget that we are all researchers. I think Arjuna Padurai writes really well about this, where he talks about it, that we've shaped this as this technical high-end activity, but actually we're all researchers. And this goes back to the dog and the nosing part. It goes back to Naomi's point about viewing reading as what reading is for you. And that's the bit that I think comes back into the core of what we want to be doing, and what we want to have as a confirmation conversation, really, because at that point, you are the person that's sort of leading that conversation. Yes, I will. I'll put that link in the chat. I'm just going to stop sharing, and perhaps if we have any kind of questions, we can come up, but otherwise I'll actually share the Apadurai text in the chat. Give me 1 second to find that for you. Okay, there we go. Give me a second. So it's called the right search. When I share something, does it come into your chats? Let me know if you see the file, otherwise I'll just put the link.
I didn't see the file in the chat, Rathna. I wonder whether we can...
I think it just has to be prose or a link.
Yeah.
Okay.
But again, if you want to send the files as well, I'm happy to circulate them to everybody.
Okay, it's just if anybody does, let me just see if I can find the... Yeah, I found it. Give me a second.
Right.
go? Okay, hopefully you should get that. Brilliant. Thank you, guys. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer that, or I'm also happy to give you 30 minutes of your life back to have a cup of tea. I think cups of tea are also extremely essential in reading and in writing literature and practice reviews. Cups of tea help you think through what you're doing. I think I've never had a cleaner a space than when I was actually writing my PhD, because actually the cleaning helped me think through the ideas. Lucy and Beth, shall